In 60 AD, the year in which Nero held his fourth consulship, a new series of games was established, Greek in style, marking the inauguration of the Neronian Games. These were loosely modeled on those founded by Augustus in Greece after his victory at Actium. The festivities were lavish and diverse, featuring public recitations, musical performances, and athletic competitions. In true Greek tradition, the athletic events were performed entirely naked. Although Nero himself did not participate in the competitions, he was nevertheless awarded a number of first prizes for his skills in Latin poetry and rhetoric. In an act of respect, he declined the prize for best performance on the lyre, instead placing it at the foot of a statue of Augustus, honoring Rome's first emperor. Following the success of these games, work began on constructing an impressive public bathhouse and an adjoining gymnasium. Yet, despite these grand projects, all was not entirely well for Nero. It was said that in this same year, just as in the year of Emperor Claudius's death, a comet appeared in the sky, a sign often taken as an ill omen. It has also been suggested that Nero may have suffered a bout of ill health during this period, raising the pressing question of who might succeed him. Such speculation led Nero to quietly exile Rubellius Plautus to his estates in Asia Minor. Plautus was considered a potential rival, given his direct descent from both Augustus and Tiberius. In that same year, Rome experienced both triumphs and setbacks in its foreign campaigns, particularly in Armenia and Britain. General Corbulo achieved a significant victory by capturing the Armenian capital of Artaxata, leading to the installation of the pro-Roman Tigrans as king of Armenia. Britain, however, told a very different story. The previous year, Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe and a client ruler under Rome, died. In his will, he named both Emperor Nero and his daughters as co-heirs to his kingdom. However, when the Romans moved to claim the territory on Nero's behalf, the financial procurator Catus Decianus acted with extraordinary cruelty. He plundered Iceni lands, confiscated weapons, and imposed heavy demands on the population. These actions deeply angered the widowed queen, Boudica, who attempted to resist. Her resistance was crushed. She was publicly flogged, and both of her daughters were brutally raped by Roman soldiers. Outraged, the Iceni allied with the Trinovantes tribe to the south, who had their own grievances against Rome. Together, they began a rebellion. At the time, Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was engaged in a campaign against the Druids on the island of Anglesey. This allowed Boudica to strike first, defeating a special Roman force sent to stop her before marching on the Roman settlement of Camulodunum. The rebels sacked the town, destroying it completely, and even removed the head from a statue of Emperor Claudius. From Camulodunum, Boudica's forces advanced on Londinium and then Verulamium, raiding and burning both towns. Thousands of Roman citizens and local allies were massacred. In their fury, however, the rebels missed a key opportunity. They failed to cut off Governor Paulinus, who returned from Anglesey ahead of most of his troops and soon rejoined the main Roman force. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Paulinus now held a tactical advantage. He led his legionaries to meet Boudica's army in open battle. The rebels, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear against the tightly packed Roman formation, found themselves pressed against the legionaries' shields. Their long swords, designed for sweeping blows, proved ineffective at such close range, while the short Roman gladi, built for stabbing, proved deadly. As the Romans pushed forward, tribal warriors fell in great numbers. Their retreat was blocked by a line of wagons they had drawn up behind them, overconfident in their impending victory. The battle turned into a slaughter. Following their defeat, Boudica took her own life by poison rather than face capture. The Romans exacted brutal revenge on the rebel territories, devastating much of eastern England and causing widespread famine among the survivors. In the aftermath, the freedman Polyclitus was sent to assess the situation in Britain. Before long, Paulinus was replaced as governor. Archaeological evidence of the rebellion, particularly the destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, can still be found today. However, the exact location of the final battle remains unknown. By 62 AD, political changes in Rome gave Nero the opportunity to divorce his wife, Claudia Octavia. The death of Sextus Afranius Burrus, who had always opposed the divorce, cleared the way. Nero justified his actions by claiming that Octavia had failed to provide him with an heir. However, Octavia's marriage to Nero had given him a crucial connection to the lineage of Augustus, legitimizing his position as emperor. She was also personally popular with the Roman public. This made her removal politically risky. To strengthen his hold on power, Nero's ally Tigellinus advised eliminating two other potential rivals, Faustus Sulla, husband of Claudia Antonia, Claudius's other daughter, and Rubellius Plautus, who was already in exile. Both men were executed without trial, accused of plotting against the emperor. In less than 2 weeks, Nero finalized his divorce and married his mistress, the pregnant Poppaea Sabina. The public, however, was outraged by Octavia's exile to Campania. Protests and demonstrations broke out in her defense. To suppress the unrest, Nero turned to his loyal freedman Anicetus, persuading him to publicly confess to committing adultery with Octavia. Anicetus complied, and in return was granted a comfortable exile in Sardinia. Claudia Octavia, on the other hand, was exiled to the island of Pandataria, where she was executed only a few days later. Her veins were opened in such a way as to make her death appear to be a suicide. Since Claudia Octavia had not produced an heir, the birth of Nero and Poppaea's daughter, Claudia, in January of 63 AD at the imperial villa in Antium, was a moment of great joy for the entire imperial household. The Senate bestowed numerous honors upon both Poppaea and the infant, including granting them both the prestigious title of Augusta. Many senators traveled to the villa, where they were ceremoniously received into the infant Claudia's presence. However, the joy was short-lived. Only a few months after her birth, their daughter died. Nero's grief was as deep and intense as the happiness he had displayed at her arrival. Following her death, Claudia was deified, but no further children would be born to Nero and Poppaea. That same year, it was reported that the imperial gymnasium had been struck by lightning and consumed by flames so intense that a bronze statue of Nero melted in the heat. Some sources, however, placed this event in the previous year. By the year 64 AD, the influence of Tigellinus and Poppaea had grown considerably, and discontent was quietly spreading among the Roman nobility. Despite this atmosphere, Nero pressed ahead with plans to make his debut artistic performance to a mass audience. Choosing not to perform in Rome, he instead selected Naples, a former Greek colony, believing that those steeped in Greek culture would appreciate his artistic skills more than the Roman elite. Possibly in preparation for this event, Nero expanded his Augustiani entourage to an extraordinary 5,000 members. The demand to see the emperor perform was overwhelming, and so the multi-day event was staged in an open-air arena, rather than a theater, to accommodate the crowds. Nero performed for several consecutive days, but the shows were abruptly interrupted by an earthquake. It is said that during the first tremor, Nero refused to stop, determined to complete his performance. Later that same day, after both performers and spectators had departed, the arena collapsed. Taking this as a fortunate omen, Nero composed a poem thanking the gods that no lives had been lost. After his success in Naples, Nero planned to sail to Greece, stopping first at Beneventum. There, he received news of the suicide of Decimus Junius Silanus Torquatus, the brother of the late Marcus Junius Silanus. Nero had arranged for Torquatus to face charges of harboring imperial ambitions before leaving for Naples. Upon hearing of the suicide, Nero lamented that, had Torquatus delayed his death until after the charges were formally brought, he would have been spared by the emperor's own clemency. Following this event, Nero abandoned his plan to travel to Greece, although no clear reason was given. It is suggested that a combination of his growing suspicions and the shock of Torquatus' suicide may have influenced his decision. Returning to Rome, Nero began to consider a journey to the eastern provinces, particularly to Egypt. When addressing the people, he reassured them that his absence would be brief and that all affairs of state would continue as normal. Seeking the most favorable moment for his journey, Nero ascended the Capitoline Hill, the smallest of Rome's 7 hills, to make sacrifices to the gods, especially Jupiter and Apollo. Initially, the omens appeared favorable. However, upon descending to the temple of Vesta, he suffered a sudden seizure. Interpreting this as a bad sign from the guardian goddess of the Roman people, Nero promptly cancelled the trip. Publicly, he claimed that he could not bear to be parted from his beloved people. To prove his devotion, Nero initiated a series of lavish celebrations, which reportedly culminated in an extravagant gathering organized by Tigellinus. This included a controversial mock wedding ceremony in which Nero, acting as the bride, was married to the freedman Pythagoras, an act that many in Roman society viewed as scandalous excess. The imperial court's indulgence was soon overshadowed by disaster. On the 18th of July, 64 AD, a fire broke out in the area of the Campus Martius and quickly consumed the shops and stalls nearby. Driven by strong winds, the flames spread rapidly, surging up the Palatine Hill and destroying everything in their path, including much of Nero's palace. The emperor himself was not in Rome that night, but in Antium. In the early hours of the morning, a messenger brought him the news of the fire. Nero immediately set out for Rome. Although the city had maintained a fire brigade since 21 BC, the scale of the disaster demanded the emperor's personal leadership. Upon his arrival, he organized firefighting efforts and opened public buildings, temples in the field of Mars, and his own gardens to shelter survivors. These safe spaces provided refuge from the flames and a place to tend to the injured. Nero threw himself wholeheartedly into the firefighting efforts, working tirelessly for 6 days until it seemed the disaster had finally been brought under control. Exhausted, those who had battled the flames sought rest, but their relief was short-lived. The fire flared up again, this time in the area belonging to Tigellinus, and raged with renewed force for another 3 days. Out of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 managed to escape destruction, leaving 75% of the city reduced to ashes. Popular legend claims that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. While it is true that he allegedly wept profusely and recited poetry at the site of the disaster, if he had played any instrument, it would most likely have been a lyre rather than a fiddle, which did not exist at the time. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, Nero took steps to aid the population. He arranged for additional grain supplies to be brought in and drastically reduced prices so that food was affordable for the desperate citizens. Yet, despite these measures, suspicion and blame fell upon him and his associates, particularly Tigellinus. Nero personally walked through the ruined city to plan the rebuilding and issued a number of new regulations designed to make Rome a safer place. However, public trust eroded further when he claimed for himself a vast tract of land to construct his enormous new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, covering an astonishing 100 acres. At the same time as his palace plans, Nero also proposed an ambitious canal to be dug from Lake Avernus to the port of Ostia to improve grain supply routes. However, this project was eventually abandoned. Meanwhile, the question of who was truly responsible for the fire remained unanswered. The blame was soon shifted toward the growing sect of Christians, who refused to honor the Roman gods and were therefore accused of bringing divine wrath upon the city. The exact number of Christians killed in the ensuing persecution is unknown, but the methods of execution were particularly brutal. Victims were coated in pitch and set alight as human torches, torn apart by dogs, or crucified. But the Great Fire of Rome had another grave consequence. In 62 AD, shortly after his withdrawal from political life, the philosopher Seneca had been implicated, through accusations made by the informer Romanus, in a plot involving the senator Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. Although Seneca successfully defended himself and the charges faded from attention, Piso harbored deep resentment toward Nero. Outwardly maintaining the appearance of friendship with the emperor, Piso quietly began to gather disaffected senators into a conspiracy after the fire, when Nero's rebuilding plans were widely seen as excessive and self-serving. Piso sought to recruit Seneca, who initially refused, though not necessarily out of loyalty to Nero. Seneca is believed to have become involved only after his nephew, the poet Aeneas Lucanus, better known simply as Lucan, joined the conspiracy. At the same time, certain officers in the Praetorian Guard, including their second-in-command, Prefect Fenius Rufus, were also discussing the possibility of rebellion. While these two groups met to explore the idea of collaboration, their talks ended in stalemate, as neither faction could move forward without the full support of the other. The situation changed when Epicharis, a freedwoman and the lover of Lucan's father, Aeneas Mela, attempted to persuade Volusius Proculus, a captain in the Misenum fleet, to join the plot. Proculus, however, betrayed her to Nero. Epicharis was arrested while Nero was vacationing in Baiae, but fear of what she might reveal once in Tigellinus' custody pushed the conspirators to act quickly. Their initial plan was for Piso to assassinate Nero while the emperor visited his villa, but this was abandoned, likely due to concerns that Piso's absence from the city might allow someone else to seize power in the chaos. Eventually, they decided to strike during the Festival of Ceres in April 65 AD. The idea was for Piso to be escorted by Prefect Rufus to the Praetorian Guards camp immediately afterward, where he would be proclaimed emperor. However, the conspiracy collapsed when one of the plotters betrayed the plan. Nero acted without hesitation, ordering Piso's execution without trial. When the Praetorians arrived at his door, Piso did not resist. Instead, he took his own life. When it came to Seneca, Emperor Nero appeared to show a certain degree of hesitation, even after both Poppaea and Tigellinus, each having personal motives to desire Seneca's death, joined in urging action against him. Instead of immediately ordering his execution, Nero dispatched the Praetorian tribune Silvanus, who was himself among the conspirators, to hear Seneca's explanation. By the time Silvanus returned to Nero with Seneca's reply, circumstances had shifted. When Lucan's involvement in the conspiracy was uncovered, Silvanus was sent back to Seneca bearing an official warrant, either for his arrest or for him to take his own life. Silvanus delayed in delivering this warrant, seeking the counsel of Rufus on whether to present it, but eventually went to Seneca, seeking to preserve the secrecy of the Praetorian Guards' complicity in the conspiracy. Upon receiving the warrant, Seneca is said to have lamented, "Nero murdered his mother and brother. Now there is nothing worse left for him to do than kill his foster father and teacher." While Seneca's role in the conspiracy is recorded in various ancient sources, many modern historians doubt the likelihood of his direct involvement. Of the approximately 40 conspirators, at least 17 were executed, while others were either pardoned or sent into exile. Phoenius Rufus was beheaded and replaced as prefect by Nymphides Sabinus. The freedman Milichus, who revealed the plot, was richly rewarded with wealth and granted the honorary title of Savior. Epicharis, rather than face the ongoing torture she was subjected to, took her own life. Following the failure of the conspiracy, Nero turned on those who had sought to honor him for having survived it, actively instructing his agents to seek out any further possible plots. In the years that followed, both close allies of the emperor and his political enemies alike would meet their deaths. Among these victims was Claudia Antonia, the last surviving child of the former emperor Claudius, who was accused of participating in the conspiracy and sentenced to death after she refused Nero's offer of marriage. The year 65 AD also brought Nero a personal blow, the death of his beloved wife, Poppaea. Ancient rumor long held that Nero, in a fit of anger, fatally kicked the pregnant Poppaea after she reproached him for arriving late from the races. However, there is no reliable evidence for this story. The more probable explanation is that she miscarried early in her pregnancy, suffered severe hemorrhaging, and could not be saved. In defiance of traditional Roman funeral rites of cremation, Nero had her embalmed in the Egyptian royal fashion and personally delivered her funeral eulogy. In 66 AD, Nero married for the third time, taking as his wife Statilia Messalina, the widow of the consul Vestinus Atticus, who had been compelled to commit suicide in the wake of the Piso conspiracy. That same year, Nero finally set out on his long-postponed journey to Greece. Demonstrating his disdain for the Senate, he appointed the freedmen Helius and Polyclitus to manage the affairs of the empire in his absence, assisted by Prefect Nymphides Sabinus. The diminished Senate raised no opposition, and in September Nero and his large retinue departed Rome. Sometime after arriving in Greece, in 67 AD, Nero invited the famed general Corbulo to meet him in Corinth. Corbulo, accepting the invitation in good faith, was instead met with an order to commit suicide, likely due to his association with Vinicianus. Corbulo complied without resistance. Shortly thereafter, the commanders of the Rhine armies, the brothers Rufus and Proculus Scribonius, who may have corresponded with Corbulo, received similar orders and likewise ended their own lives. Before leaving Rome, Nero had informed the Greeks that he wished to take part in all of their festivals, and the entire schedule was adjusted to accommodate him. Traveling across Greece, he competed in numerous events and was awarded roughly 1,800 prizes, including one for driving a 10-horse chariot, despite the race ending in a crash from which he narrowly escaped with his life. Nevertheless, haunted by the memory of his mother and the vengeance of the Furies, Nero avoided visiting both Athens and Eleusis. During this period, Nero encountered a slave named Sporus, who bore such a remarkable resemblance to the late Poppia that Nero had the youth castrated and married him. The noblewoman Calvia Crispinilla was placed in charge of Sporus's attire, tasked with dressing him in garments of the highest quality, styling his hair, and applying cosmetics so that he might appear the very image of Nero's deceased wife. Nero's tour concluded in November 67 AD with the dramatic announcement that Greece was to be granted its freedom, meaning exemption from the payment of taxes to Rome. In an additional gesture, he ceremonially turned the first shovelful of earth for a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth. However, as with his earlier canal project from Lake Avernus to Ostia, the work was never completed. To many Romans, Nero's conduct in Greece was proof of his Hellenic sympathies and his love of extravagant display, which only deepened resentment towards him. Events outside Greece also demanded attention. Unrest had been growing in Judea and across the Jewish diaspora since the previous year, culminating in the massacre of a Roman garrison at Masada. Early in 67 AD, this unrest escalated into full-scale war following the murder of the Syrian governor. Vespasian was appointed commander of 3 legions to suppress the uprising and achieved considerable success, reaching Jerusalem by the summer of 68 AD. Nevertheless, final victory would not come until 70 AD, 2 years after Nero's death, with sporadic resistance lasting until 73 AD. Although Nero had planned to remain in Greece for 2 years, the situation in Rome was deteriorating. Helius made repeated attempts to persuade him to return, but Nero ignored these calls. It was only when Helius personally traveled to Greece to meet him that Nero acknowledged the seriousness of the growing hostility in the capital and agreed to return. Even so, Nero took time to stage a triumph in Naples and another upon reaching Rome, driving in Augustus's own triumphal chariot. Yet he quickly departed again, spending the spring of 68 AD in the Bay of Naples. His respite was interrupted by news that Gaius Julius Vindex, a Romanized Gaul, had risen in rebellion and was raising an army. Nero seemed largely unconcerned and delayed in forming the Senate. When he finally met them, it was in a newly completed section of his Golden House, where he preferred to discuss its engineering rather than the rebellion. On April 2, Servius Sulpicius Galba declared allegiance to the Senate instead of Nero and began assembling forces, including the recruitment of a second legion. He swiftly gained the backing of other governors, among them Otho in Lusitania. In response, Nero declared himself sole suffect consul and ordered 3 legions on the Rhine to march against the rebels besieging Lugdunum, while the Italian legions were divided, some defending the river Po and others sent into Gaul. Nero is said to have briefly entertained the notion of accompanying the Italian legions, but not in the capacity of a military commander. Instead, he envisioned bringing along wagons filled with musical instruments to provide entertainment for the troops, as well as a group of concubines who would portray Amazonian warriors, though kept at a safe distance from any actual combat. Ultimately, it appears he abandoned this eccentric idea. However, the situation quickly deteriorated. The commander of the Rhine legions, Virginius, was reportedly in alliance with Vindex. This partnership, however, collapsed the very next day when the legions massacred 20,000 Gauls, driving Vindex to take his own life. Despite being repeatedly hailed as imperator by his men, Virginius refused to march into Italy. Instead, he wrote to the Senate to declare that he would await their formal instructions. As the weeks passed, Nero seemed to be preparing to redeploy several legions and was making plans to travel to Alexandria in order to gather a sufficiently large force to return and defend Italy. Behind the scenes, However, Nymphidius Sabinus was plotting Nero's downfall in concert with an agent of Galba. On what was likely Nymphidius' advice, an advance party, including many of Nero's freedmen and members of his Germanic bodyguard, was sent ahead to Alexandria. This left only the praetorians, under the command of the prefect, to protect the emperor. When Nero instructed the praetorians to escort him to the port of Ostia, they refused. That evening, he went to bed still under guard, but in the middle of the night he awoke to find that both the praetorians and many of his servants had deserted him. The palace was nearly empty. Fleeing with 2 freedmen, Phaon and Epaphroditus, and the eunuch Sporus, Nero made his way to Phaon's villa outside Rome. Later that night, news reached the villa that Nero had been deposed in favor of Galba, declared a public enemy, and sentenced to the ancient punishment of being paraded naked through the streets before being beaten to death with rods. Epaphroditus urged him to take his own life rather than suffer such humiliation. At dawn on the 9th of June, Nero went outside the villa and, with Epaphroditus' assistance, drove a dagger into his throat just as soldiers arrived to arrest him. He is said to have uttered the famous last words, "What an artist dies here," before he expired. His body was claimed by his former mistress, Claudia Act, and prepared for burial by her and 2 nurses who had cared for him since childhood. He was quietly cremated, and his ashes were placed in the family tomb of the Domitii. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. Yet Rome would not find stability. In the following year it would be thrown into the chaos of the civil war known to history as the Year of the 4 Emperors. Ancient historians often divided Nero's reign into 2 distinct periods, the good years and the bad years, the turning point being the death of his mother, Agrippina. Having ascended to the principate at a young age through her political maneuvering, Nero was heavily guided in the early years of his rule by his advisors, Seneca and Burrus. Agrippina's influence gradually diminished, making it difficult to judge Nero's early governance as entirely his own. At the outset, he was well liked and implemented a variety of reforms and decrees that benefited Romans of all social classes. He cooperated with the Senate and put an end to the feared Maesta's trials that had claimed many lives under previous emperors. His passion for the arts brought the people popular entertainment, with theatrical performances and chariot races being favored over the more brutal gladiatorial games. His public works were initially beneficial to all, including the construction of a market, large public baths, a gymnasium, and the continuation of Claudius' harbor project at Ostia. He also made efforts to safeguard the grain supply, though his ambitious canal project would later be abandoned. After the murder of Agrippina and the subsequent deaths or withdrawals of Burrus and Seneca, Nero came increasingly under the sway of individuals of far darker influence. His extravagant court became a source of resentment, particularly after the Great Fire of Rome, for which he was accused of responsibility. The appropriation of a massive tract of land for his sprawling 100-acre Domus Aurea, Golden House, palace further angered the populace. Taxation to finance the rebuilding of the city, coupled with a reform allowing him to seize the wealth of those who had not named him in their wills, made him deeply unpopular. Without the restraint of his earlier advisors, Nero indulged in personal whims. While other members of the nobility sometimes appeared on stage, Nero's own performances were viewed as a direct affront to traditional Roman values. Though his political purges did not match the bloodshed seen under some earlier rulers, in his later years no one was truly safe from his suspicion, not even his old tutor Seneca. In the end, Nero's love for Hellenistic culture, coupled with his extravagance, brought about his downfall. Having survived 2 senatorial conspiracies, he was finally undone by the very man tasked with protecting him. Should Nero be remembered and defended for the positive reforms and popular entertainments of his early reign? Or should his legacy remain that of the infamous ruler who fiddled while Rome burned? History continues to debate his true character, but his name endures as one of the most controversial in the annals of the Roman Empire.